Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are gathered today on the 31st of January, 2026 on the Gregorian calendar, which happens to line up with the 23rd of the 11th month on our Creator's calendar. And we are taking a little segue from Deuteronomy here to cover something that we have mentioned before, and we just want to go into a little more detail. This is a series of lectures or writings put together by a gentleman named John Wilson, who was a believer during the 16th and 17th centuries, or the 17 and 1800s. He wrote and was very prolific in sharing about how the lost tribes, or the Northern Kingdom, were the Germanic peoples that had dispersed all throughout Europe and into England. In this particular writing, which we talked about before, it's specifically covering the mission of Eliyahu to restore all previous to our Yahuah's second advent. And I wanted to cover a little bit about what that means. I think that there's probably little of more importance to believers today because of what this purports for us. We're all supposed to be working towards the hastening of the day of Elohim, as mentioned in 2nd Kepha, chapter 3. And then, as I just mentioned to our group before, and I'll share with you all right here as well, in the Syriac version of the Recognitions of Clement, Kepha mentions right here that the present condition of the world will change when all men present their conscience to Elohim. So that's the repentance of men, just like he says he will not return in enmity. It also talks about in other places, and this is what we're going to read here in just a minute, but the sense of it is that while Yahudah was brought back into the land before they got the belief in our Mashiach, the northern kingdom will not have that benefit. We must repent of our lawlessness before he will return and bring us in. Just as the children had to get their minds and heart right in the wilderness before they were brought into the land, we are having that same issue. So right here, just to get into this here, I'm not going to skip through or read any of these real quick. We're just going to go to the first section. You can feel free at any time to pause this and read for yourself these things. And we'll go into this in more detail when we actually get to it, if we find the time to soon. I'll read this preface to you and we'll cover all that. But this man was very prolific in sharing the truth. He was given a special gift at the fulfillment of the Melohah Goyim, or the fullness of the nations becoming reality in the world, where the benefits and the blessings of the birthright promises were given to Ephraim were coming to fruition in the British Empire, being a company of nations in the midst of the earth and getting all the blessings at the gates of their enemies and everything of the prolific multiplicity of children and all of that was involved. All of that happened so they can spread the good news as it was foretold that they would do in the times where they were blind and lame, right? We had mentioned these things before, but this was the fulfillment of it. And he got to live in the times where they were just coming to the knowledge of who they were as a people, which is very exciting. It was because of this information that the Zionist movement that brought the Yahudim back to the land even became a thing, in fulfillment of foretellings in Revelation. But it was because of this movement that you had the piety and the efforts of the Bible societies of Britain and America trying to publish the word throughout the world in fulfillment of the foretellings mentioning such things, right? The blessings given to our nation were for these purposes. So you can see he goes into all the details of what Eliyahu did and how that was fulfilled and how that leads to what is going to happen for our purposes. He ties that in with the coming of Yahukanan and how he started the mission, but it was not fulfilled or completely done in him. So, Ob willing, we'll get to go and look at these things in more detail as time goes on, like I was mentioning. But in the meantime, I want to get to the first one, so please forgive me. This is all errata. They have different footnotes here. They also have an index for all the scriptural references that they use, which I find to be very worthwhile. I don't I don't ever just take anything and believe it. Everyone, especially anyone who did not have his name and the time where it was hidden, they tend to have wrong doctrines in some capacity. I've found that to be true every single time. Not not to be mean to anybody or to think that I'm special or that we know more than anyone else. It's simple. In what his word says is true is how things work. He brings a blessing when his word and his name are revealed to you. And the fact that he's given us his name in these times, and that the truth, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the available witnesses of the things that are actually in them, are fully available so that we don't have to guess about the calendar at all. Right? Um, these things were not available at these times, so you can't hold it against them. All right, so this is the mission of Eliyahu, Lecture 1, introductory. Why then say the scribes that Eliyahu must come first? And this is the preface of the art or the lecture here. It'll cover every major point. What led to this inquiry? The rising from the dead, not identical with the restoration of the kingdom to Yisrael. The connection of ideas still in the disciples' minds after our Yahuwah's resurrection, Acts 1:6, the disciples subsequently given liberty to testify of Mashiach, Acts 1:8. Reply to the question respecting the coming of Eliyahu, Matithyahu 18 or 17:11. Sorry about that. The coming of Eliyahu, not the completion of the work he was to initiate. Yahukanon the Immerser or Baptist, various views respecting the restoration of all things. After Pentecost, the restitution of all still spoken of as future. The restoration identical with the restitution of all things. This is not a mere speculative inquiry, but closely connected with truth and duty, and the enjoyment of the promises of Elohim, and encouragement to inquire and make known. Excuse me. So there's quite a bit here, but we're going to get to it. It says, when our master and the three taught ones who witnessed the transfiguration were descending from the mount on which that significant event had taken place, he charged them, saying, Matthew 17:9, quote, tell the vision to no man until the Son of Adam be risen again from the dead, unquote. They seem not to have clearly apprehended the import of his words, for as Mark tells us, 9:10, the questioned one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. They were very unwilling to think of the decease he should accomplish at Yerushalayim, and they may possibly have imagined that his rising from the dead was figurative, that it referred to an appearing in his proper dignity as the Mashiach, his coming forth in manifested glory or esteem as the long-promised king of Israel, or Yisrael. But supposing that to be the meaning they attach to the words, they would be puzzled to account for such restraint being put upon them, the emissaries of Mashiach, the three chosen witnesses of his esteem. Before the transfiguration, they had been commanded, Matithyahu 16:20, to tell no man that Yahushua was the Mashiach. And now they were forbid to speak of the remarkable witness their master had received from the Father, not only in the presence of mortal men, but also of esteemed saints or set apart ones. And you can find that they actually do witness of these events in the times after his resurrection when you read in Second Kepha chapter 3 or in the epistle of Second Kepha where he mentions, I do believe it's in chapter 3 specifically, but he mentions that they saw his esteem on the mountain and the voice that they heard. So he's even speaking of these things afterwards as he was told to. And it says, "In these Moshe and Eliyahu, two of the most remarkable names connected with the national history of Yisrael, the disciples were not to speak of this until, as they should think, that signified by the transfiguration was actually come. They would naturally be inclined to ask, was Yahushua not to be testified of to the nation? Was he not to be proclaimed by them as the Mashiach appointed of the Father, and witnessed to by Moshe and Eliyahu? Was not Eliyahu himself to go before Yahuah and to make all things ready for his coming? And were they, who had been chosen from among the 12 to behold his esteem, were they to be set aside and forced into silence until the time for proclaiming the king should be past? Now, when you realize that what they walked out was a microcosm of the truth, who Yahushua being the truth, what he walked out was the truth in history, like a mini pattern of that. And we, being his body, have done it in history in a larger scale. So that's why he had to go into Egypt and was delivered out of the same and called out of it, just as Israel was, or Yisrael was as a people before that time, right? Says their previous experience in proclaiming the kingdom would doubtless have convinced them that much yet remained to be done. And were they not now in a position to do whatever might be required of them as emissaries of Mashiach? In addition to all their former qualifications, had they not now been entrusted with the witness of Moshe and Eliyahu? Were they not now better qualified to go before the face of Yahuah, to prepare the people for the enjoyment of his kingdom? Was not their mission as the emissaries of Mashiach identical with that of Eliyahu, to whom they had now been personally introduced? But how was the mission of Eliyahu to be carried out by them with any kind of authority, if they were to be prevented from even mentioning their having met with that great foreteller of Yisrael? To be able to say that Eliyahu was indeed personally come, that they had seen him with their own eyes and heard his testimony from his own mouth, would doubtless, as they might think, give them a great advantage in dealing with the scribes. Not as yet altogether free from the influence of personal considerations and in comparative ignorance, as they were, of the times and seasons, it is little wonder they felt somewhat perplexed by the prohibition of Yahuah laid upon them. This perplexity they cautiously but sufficiently expressed by the inquiry, why then say the scribes that Eliyahu must come first? The rebuke which Peter or Kepha had received just before the transfiguration may, in the present instance, have made the taught ones more cautious in their manner of approaching the subject. They put the question as if it concerned the opinions of the scribes and the ministry of Eliyahu, rather than their own aspirations and their desire to be employed in promulgating to all men the speedy appearing of their master. In his proper dignity as king of Yisrael, and as they had beheld him on the set apart mount. That the taught ones connected the rising from the dead with the restoration of the kingdom appears plain from the question they put to our deliverer after he was risen from the dead, Acts 1:6. When they therefore were come together, they asked of him, saying, Master, will you at this time restore again the kingdom to Yisrael? When this latter question was put, they were still unable to bear the knowledge of the times and seasons, but they are given the welcome intelligence that the restraint put upon them in the days of their comparative ignorance and weakness is about to be withdrawn. He says, Acts 1:8, but you shall receive power or authority after that the Ruach HaKodesh is come upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me, both in Yerushalayim and in all Yahudah and in Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. Thus, after his resurrection, did he speak to what were probably the thoughts that passed through the minds of the taught ones, when, while descending from the Mount of Transfiguration, he commanded that they should tell the vision to no man until the Son of Adam was risen from the dead, and which thoughts prompted, but were not fully expressed by the inquiry, why then say the scribes that Eliyahu must first come? Our master's reply respecting Eliyahu is given in Matthew 17:11. Eliyahu truly shall first come and restore all things. Thus it is in our common translation. The original, however, may more literally be rendered, Eliyahu truly comes first and shall restore all things. According to the exact wording of the text, the coming of Eliyahu was an event of the time then present. It might happen in the days of those to whom the words were addressed, but the completion of the work he was to accomplish might not be until a distant period. Yet, however, it might be delayed, the restoration predicted must be before the coming of Mashiach, in the esteem in which he was beheld on the set apart mount. Eliyahu truly comes first and shall restore all things. The purpose, with Elohim's assistance, demonstrating that Eliyahu did truly or personally come in the apostolic age, even as our deliverer said, and that the work to be effected by him is in the course of accomplishment, and may well be expected to obtain its completion previous to our Yahuah's return. Indeed, the sign of his coming is the accomplishment of that work. It is the bride being made ready. That's just another way of saying that same thing that we just mentioned when all men yield their obedience to him. You can find in other places, and we can cover it as we get to them, but the foretellers talk about these times. It's because of our persistent disobedience that we're chastised and that we're going to be taken out of the places we're at, but we're going to die in the wilderness and not be brought back to the land. Um, so, things to keep in mind. These things are talked about here and there. You have foretellings that cover them in parables, in the narrative, in different ways that we have gone over and we will. But once you see these patterns and how it plays out, it's to help you not be surprised about what's coming, right? You should be able to look at history, look at what's going on, see the comparable things, and be fairly assured that the outcomes will be likewise for the people that continue either doing right or doing wrong. The pattern for righteousness is Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, 12 tribes. Boom. The pattern for inequity is you sin, then you have what? The iniquities of the fathers onto the children to the third and fourth of those who hate him. And then you have release. We've talked about that pattern before as well, but we'll get to it more in time. So it says, it is the bride being made ready. Revelation 19:7 and 8. The preparation of all Yisrael to welcome their king. What follows of our deliverer's reply must also be considered. Matthew 17:12 and 13. But I say unto you that Eliyahu is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall they also, the Son of Adam, suffer of them. Then the taught ones comprehended that he spake unto them of Yahuchanan the Immerser. It thus appears that the coming of Eliyahu had, in some sense, been exemplified in the case of the Baptist, as that forerunner of our Yahuah had been, by the Yahudim as a nation, practically rejected, so were they found unprepared for the long-predicted coming of Mashiach. His splendorous reception, and just for a little bit of context there, this is history that we don't have so well covered in the Bible. But after the Maccabean period, where they had liberated the people from the king of the Greeks and they had had a time of prosperity and blessing, they had infighting. They had schisms and problems within the family of the Maccabees, which allowed Edomites to take control of the kingdom at the hand of Rome. And that was what had transpired, as foretold, that the kingdom would be, the lawgiver would be in Yahudah until the coming of Mashiach. Now you might ask, how is that possible if a Maccabee was a king or a priest that was ruling and he was of the tribe of Louis? That's no different than when the seed of Dawid was transferred over into Ireland by the daughter of Zadik Yahu, where it carried on in the line of the woman. You can go all the way back to Yahudah's son, or the sister of Neshun, the tribal leader in the wilderness. His sister married Aharon, and all the sons of Aaron, all the sons of Aharon were intermarried with Yahudah from that point on, even the Maccabees. There was even more intermarriage between them, between certain families of Yahudah and Louis, where at the advent of our Mashiach, Miriam, who was of the seed of Dawid, was cousins to a woman who was of the daughters of Aaron or Aharon. So these are known things in scripture, and it was foretold about that he would come of them both in Yobelim. You can see about that in there. When the kahuna was given to Louis and the kingdom was given to Yahudah, the foretellings about that were given to them. It's also in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, if I remember correctly. But point being, uh, the things that he foretold happened, right? And one of the things that were foretold was that after the coming of Herod, when he appointed a leader over Aharon, when he appointed the kahuna, instead of it being according to the will of our Creator, and it was just the fiat choice of a man, the Edomite king, that was when they were told to flee to the wilderness and not light his altar in vain. This is what the Dead Sea Scrolls go into detail about, where the schismatic faction, if you will, the sectarians left and started keeping the communities outside of the cities. This is like a microcosm of the assemblies being built before they happened. And it's also a pattern of things, but I don't want to get too far into that. The point is, after Zechariah's death, his father died. They had people going off and leaving in the wilderness, not living out there. And this is where Yahukion himself was raised. It mentions in there that when they had a quorum of 15 people walking in truth, that would be the time of going off to prepare the way for Yahuwah in the wilderness, which is what he actually did. So I just mentioned all those things, that he wasn't just willy-nilly doing things. It directly says that the word of Yahuwah, or that he listened to a voice, but the word of Yahuwah came, someone, and told him to go do these things. And you can find the written words about the advent of those happening in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are now available to us if you want to check them out. I believe that section is in the Community Rule or the Damascus Document, one of those two writings, and the associated writings with the assembly that was outside of the land or outside of the city, that was keeping the laws of, not the laws of the altar, but they were keeping the laws as they could without sacrifices. It says, his splendorous reception by the people of the Elohim of Abraham must therefore be reserved for a future generation, when the work of Eliyahu, or when the work Eliyahu was to do, will have been accomplished. And that's another thing, like the inversions there. If you remember, in the time of Eliyahu, his works, that he got the people to confess Yahuwah alone, but they rebelled. They immediately went back into apostasy and didn't stay true to what they professed with their own mouth. That work will be inverted in this time to come, that when we come to the truth and it's culminated, they will come full-heartedly and we'll get that restoration of all. That this, I believe, is the premise of this lectures here. So, had the preaching of the Baptist or immerser been effectual in turning the hearts of the people to Yahuwah so as to make them willing to receive their king and become obedient to his law, Yahukanon would have been Eliyahu to them. Yea, the very Eliyahu which was for to come. Thus clearly is indicated the kind of restoration to be effected by Eliyahu. It is not a restoration of any mere outward condition, but a turning of the heart to Yahuwah and to each other in the fear and love of Elohim. And if this end has been obtained by the preaching of the Baptist or immerser, the work of Eliyahu in regard to them would have been accomplished. Into the various views which have hitherto been held respecting the coming of Eliyahu and the restoration of all things, we do not at present particularly enter. Some have supposed that the restoration of all things was effected by Yahukanon the immerser, but this certainly would be somewhat difficult to demonstrate. This much, however, may be freely admitted, that the ministry of the Baptist recorded as it is in the beginning of the New Testament, and coming forth unto all Yisrael, the 12 tribes scattered abroad, may indeed be useful in recalling them to a practical acknowledgement of Elohim in the regulation of their lives. And isn't that the condition that we find so lacking in our people today? A practical acknowledgement of Elohim and the regulation of our lives, thinking that the law is nailed to the stake, not actually doing it, right? But look back at what Eliyahu did, and as you read these, you'll see he was correcting and trying to stem the tide of wrongs that were being done. If you're a soldier, here's rules to live by: not to mistreat others, and so as to be prepared for when Yahuwah was to come. Right? Everything that was in regard to whoever came to him was to correct any faults in preparation for the truth that was going to visit them. And if you remember how you were, your disposition or the ruach in you at the time of visitation determined whether you would be blind, cursed, and having problems, or you would have healing, restoration, and benefit. And that's also from the exhortation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It says, in the several relations, both private and public, an essential part of any restoration that we can expect to be permanently productive of good. The Baptist ministry may hereafter have that effect in regard to all Yisrael, which it had not upon the Yahudim. This subject will, however, more fully come before us hereafter. Some, looking far into the future, have suggested a resurrection of the bodies, not only of all men, but of the whole animal creation. Others again supposing the promise to regard, and this is thinking beyond what is written. This is taking the bits and pieces, and instead of looking for answers in his word, you just fill it up with stuff in your own mind or whatever inclination you might be most suited towards. That kind of thing is directly prohibited and called a Gnostic heresy by the recognitions, by the apostolic constitutions. Irenaeus is against heresies. It's not something we ought to do. Even the Bible itself condemns thinking beyond what is written. So I always try to remind myself and everybody of that. We're supposed to come to the truth as a little child, not making things up of our own, but coming to him for the answers for everything. And if we do that, if we're sincere and we knock, ask, and seek, he will open, answer, and we shall find, just as he said, right? Says how either of these restorations is to be effected by Eliyahu before the coming of Mashiach and in preparation for his kingdom is not very apparent. When Mashiach comes in his kingdom, all will not have been restored even as to the life of the body. The Kodashim are to be raised at his coming, and afterwards is the resurrection of all that are in the graves. or in their graves. And then will be the general judgment, or the great white throne judgment, when before his face the present heaven and earth will pass away, not till after which are we given the new heavens and the new earth, wherein dwells righteousness. No more tears, no more sorrow, no more pain, no remembrance of the evils. Some things, doubtless, are to be restored by our Yahuwah himself at his coming, and others after he has come. And therefore, all things without exception cannot have been restored by Eliyahu before our Yahuwah's return. But the all things spoken of by our deliverer are to be restored first, or before his own second advent. It is equally plain that the restoration was not completed by the Baptist. Even after the baptism of the Ruach had been bestowed, as predicted both by Yahuchanan and by Yahushua, the promised restoration of all things was still pointed forward to, as something which was yet to happen. At the same time, it was spoken of as that which was to take place previous to the second advent. Thus Kepha, who had been especially promised the keys of the kingdom of heaven, one of the three taught ones to whom the words were addressed, quote, Eliyahu verily comes first and shall restore all things, unquote. Speaking of Mashiach as having gone into the Shamayim and of the preparation to be wrought in the people for his return, says in Acts 3, verse 21, quote, whom the Shamayim must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which Elohim spoke by the mouth of all his set-apart foretellers since the world began. The restitution of all, spoken of by Kepha, is the restoration of all predicted by our Yahuwah. Kepha, it may be noted, or noticed, intimates a better knowledge of the times and seasons than he had before receiving the Pentecostal anointing. He now knew that the restoration was not to be the work of a day, but of times, a lengthened process, through many long years of trial and tribulation, requiring, it might be, painful labor and patient waiting, in the course of which he was himself to grow old in the toils and cares of the Nazari ministry, and at length suffer a violent death, as his master had showed him. And he was walking out the truth, as he was the body of Mashiach, and they represented the 12 tribes who they went to teach. The truth of that assembly being killed in the later part of his life is what was being shown. Some of the assemblies that were brought forth by them were killed early on, like some of the emissaries that were killed early on. It's a picture and a pattern for our benefit. The prophetic word or foretold word made more certain, if you know what I'm talking about. How what they walked out was what would happen to the people later on in a larger scale. It may also be observed that the restoration promised by our Yahuwah and spoken of by Kepha was not to be dimly guessed at from one or two isolated passages in the renewed covenant. It must be such a, quote, restoration of all things, unquote, as occupies a considerable body of Old Testament foretelling. The all things to be restored are the things of which Elohim has spoken by the mouth of all his foretellers since the world began. Acts 3:21. And if you remember that the very creation account itself is a parable of all the works that the word of Elohim would do from the beginning of creation until the millennial reign, this is literally true, that from the beginning, all of these things were foretold. The subject upon which we are entering may at first sight seem more distant and speculative than practical, or of any immediate concern to us, and such is indeed the character of much that has hitherto been said upon the coming of Eliyahu. It is hoped that The view here propounded will be found very different in kind, and more in accordance with truth and usefulness, that it will not only prove useful to obtaining a clear comprehension of much of that seems obscure in the foretold scriptures and in providence, but will be found most closely connected with our duty in regard to Elohim, His Word, ourselves, and each other, and this in all our relations, social, ecclesiastical, and political. It throws a flood of prophetic light upon our position, the most important a nation ever occupied, and this at the most monumentous period of the world's history, when the means which have been accumulating throughout all ages are being sought out and are combinedly to be used in preparing Yahuwah's people for his splendorous return. By such quiet calls as those contained in these lectures, some may be induced to attend to the grand or to the glad invitation. Behold, the bridegroom comes. Go you forth to meet him. Others may require to be more roughly shaken in order to be aroused from their slumbers by whatever means awakened. By whatever means awakened, those who are awake will, it is expected, find that the mission of Eliyahu most deeply concerns them and all they have the power of benefiting, whether with regard to the world that now is or that which is to come. It is a curious circumstance that what the Yahudim, with all their gorgeous national worship, were unprepared to receive, and what the emissaries themselves seem to have been for a time forbid to declare, our Yahuwah himself, at the very early period of his ministry, made known to a woman at Jacob's well, near Sychar in Samaria, as recorded in Yahuchanan 4, 5 through 42, where he says, I who am speaking is he, plainly telling her that he was the Mashiach, right? And very encouraging it is to any who, in the simplicity of their hearts, desire to make known the deliverer to others, that Yahushua privileged that poor woman to be a co-worker with himself in the work of Elohim. Now, while she witnessed the truth, she was a hopefully repentant sinner. But if you remember, the first thing in like what should happen to all of us when we come to him, we're convicted of our sins, where our faults are brought right to the heart. She was an adulterous woman. She had had 5 different partners. The man that she was with wasn't even her husband, and he called her out. You can't continue in something like that and be acceptable. But acknowledging the truth and then confessing him was a great step towards the right direction. We just have to make sure that we have to continue on to perfection. We can't go back to the same things that he's pointed out are wrong and think that he's going to be happy with us. It says, in her heart, he sowed the seed which, by her making the appropriate confession with the mouth, speedily sprang up into a harvest which Yahuwah himself condescended by his further impersonal ministry to aid in bringing to maturity. And he stayed with them 2 days, right? She belonged to a sect with whom the Orthodox worshippers at Yerushalayim refused to have any dealings. And even among her own people, she seems to have been a comparative outcast. Yet was she privileged successfully to make known the truth as it is in Yahushua. And this, while the emissaries appear to have been more mindful of what was needful for the body. Altogether occupied with her glorious message, she forgot the object of her journey to the well, where she had found the deliverer, and hastened to the men of her city, saying, Come, see a man that told me all things that I ever did. She placed before them the evidence she had received of Yahushua's omniscience, and asked, Is not this the Mashiach? And the result was a thorough conviction of the truth of her testimony. And so we afterwards find them saying to the woman, verse 42, now we believe, not because of your saying, for you have heard him, or for we have heard him ourselves, and know that this is indeed the Mashiach, the deliverer of the world. The emissaries, we may well believe, were as yet unprepared to make such a testimony, and certain we are, they were afterwards for a time forbid to tell that Yahushua is the Mashiach. His Mashiachship was a much greater subject than they, with their Yahudi prejudices, were then able to handle. But Yahushua put no such prohibition upon the poor convinced sinner, the woman of Samaria, nor does he despise and refuse to make use of such testimony now. And remember, he even used the testimony of the demoniac, the one who was possessed by legion after he was cured. He wouldn't let him come with him. He says, stay in your own country, but go profess all the things that Elohim did for you. Right? Let him that hears say, come. The successors of the emissaries may, like the emissaries themselves, stand coldly by, and be ready to ask, what seek you, or why talk you with her? Let not this or any other discouragement prevent any poor creature from doing the work of Elohim. Elohim has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and Elohim has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and base things of the world, and things which are despised, have Elohim chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should esteem in his presence. 1 Corinthians 1:27 through 9. That doesn't make sense there, but maybe it goes into the next chapter. And that is the end of lecture 1 there, so I think we'll have to wrap that up for now. I hope that this was edifying for everyone, and if anyone's interested in hearing this more, let me know. We might put these on as well. In the meantime, you have a great rest of your Sabbath, a great Shavua Tov, and we will talk to you next week. Shalom.